We are in a time of horrible economic and political disaster. I don't think people, a lot of times it's easy for us, especially in the United States, to forget that. I used to joke that in the 80s, we had a few preachers that stood up and said, "The end of the world is coming! Jesus is coming!" Who here heard that in the 80s? Televangelist or whatever. Okay? We have those people now, and they're NASA scientists. They're not evangelicals. They are our leading scientists are telling us that the end of the world is coming. And no one is listening. The oceans are dying. Half of the coral reefs are already dead, and in the next 20 years, there's a good chance almost all the coral reefs will die because of acidity in the ocean, because of climate change. That's not including the cultural disaster that we are in. We have a mental health epidemic in the United States and in industrialized Europe of which we've never seen in human history. We have more people taking antidepressant medication, anti-anxiety medication. There's some estimates of 15 to 20% of the population is on these drugs. I'm not saying these drugs are bad. I think they're needed. I support people getting the support for those drugs. But the point is, people are depressed. And our communities are falling apart. We have anywhere from 2 to 10 times more in communities suicide than we've ever had. And you want a predictor of mental health problems and suicide. You want to know where that is, that those problems are happening. The biggest predictor is social capital, which is a sociological index developed by the scholar Robert Putnam that is able to measure how much community people have. Their depth and diversity of community is by far the biggest predictor of mental health problems, of suicide, of our culture falling apart. And guess what? We have less social capital now than we ever. These institutions like Catholic Peace Ministries are falling apart in many places. Churches are falling apart. All these things that held our culture together are falling apart. Our culture is individualist. And consumerism, the idea that we get our needs met by consumption, has become the dominant philosophy of our culture, with a propaganda system that is bigger than anything we've ever seen, with messages that would make Nazi Germany, Goebbels, who's the head of propaganda for the Nazis, he would look mild compared to the system of propaganda teaching us not to be in community. That the market and making money and all these things are the way to go. And I have two other facts that are absolutely horrible. This is one of the only times I study social movements and democratic movements across the globe. And pretty much for the last 100 years, almost every year we had more countries that were democratic than the year in the past. We were in a forward motion. The world was becoming more democratic. These last 3 years have been one of the first time in the last 100 years that we have less countries that are democratic now than we had 3 years ago. Dictatorships propped up by corporate power are becoming more and more powerful. Even what I think is to be an amazing thing in America, which is that we have more diversity now than we ever had before, and that we're going to have more diversity in the next 20 or 30 years. We're going to be a country primarily of people of color, I think is a good thing for our country. And even that, we have the worst racist backlash I've ever seen in my lifetime with Trump getting elected. And this is just the last one I'll end with, about why we're in a horrible position, why we're in death. And I say this to high schoolers when I speak to high schoolers, and they feel it, is in American history, almost always the children of the parents always had a sense of hope that they might do better than their parents. And that was just in the American culture. And statistically, that almost always happens. Statistically, the parents would do better. This is one of the first generations that statistically kids are not going to do as well financially as their parents. And that dread, if you're young, is a big deal. You feel that dread. death and destruction. Okay, now the resurrection. We have to take issues and we have to keep on fighting in our community. We have to keep on talking at Thanksgiving dinner tables. Maybe our Uncle Earl, who's racist from the South, he might not come along, but we need to talk. We need to have these conversations in churches. That's what Catholic Peace Ministries is doing. We need to keep on having those conversations so that a lot of what we believe becomes the mainstream. And I'll tell two inspiring stories. One is, most people don't realize this, but Obama, Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, a majority of the Democratic Party was not supportive of same-sex marriage or LGBT rights 15 years ago. Okay? They actually, not only that, with the Republicans, they were leaders in passing the Defense of Marriage Act. Okay, which basically destroyed the state rights to do same-sex marriage, okay? They were not supportive of that. But the LGBT movement knew something. And Harvey Milk said, we need to build a movement. It's not going to come from top, it's going to come from us. And one of the things he advocated very strongly is we have to come out of the closet. Everyone has to come out of the closet if you're gay. Because we got to bring it to our families. We got to bring it to our communities. And when that decision was made, it changed everything. And it was risky. I mean, there was propositions to fire all the teachers that were openly gay in the country at that time, in the 70s, even in the 80s. So they made a decision to fight and resist and not to be afraid, not to be ashamed, not to isolate. Every single year, there's very few issues that are like this. Every single year, public opinion has supported LGBT rights since the movement made that decision. Every single year. Now it's inevitable that same-sex marriage is not only the law of the land, public support for it everywhere, even in Republican states, is now hitting a majority. And guess what happens? It's like Jesus comes down and all these politicians have this moral conversion. I was praying to Jesus and now I support same-sex marriage. Just when a majority of the public makes it possible, makes it inevitable, makes it so they have to support same-sex marriage. Okay? That came from the movement. It did not come from the politicians. It came from people like you. That's the same thing. We determine the limits of their oppression is defined by our movement, by our communities. If there is a possibility to make a buck on war, we are the limits of what they're able to do. And I'll say one other thing. A lot of my work now at the Center for the Working Poor, I do trainings to social movements. And one of my best friends and is a dreamer. Who here knows what a dreamer is? He is one of the leading activists and organizers within the Dream movement. And most people don't know this. I was part of the immigrant rights movement as part of the labor movement with Francis. And there was a huge debate about how to spend resources and should we fight for overall immigrant rights or should we really support dreamers and try to do really focus on winning something specifically for a specific set of workers. And I was kind of on the side that we should fight for all immigrants or whatever, but Carlos and a whole bunch of dreamers formed a movement that in a lot of ways had similarities to the LGBT movement. They trained people in public narrative. Who here has heard of public narrative? It's the community organizing tool that Francis and I know, which is a lot about telling the story. And he did trainings to 8,000 dreamers across the country, teaching them how to tell their story and really come out of the closet because people were ashamed. People were afraid of saying, I'm undocumented in the United States of America. And what happened is, magically, there's all these dreamers in every high school and church and all this, and this changed public opinion. And now, and I want to say this, Obama was not supportive to the dreamers. He did not, they had to sit in the Obama offices, and he said, we don't have the legal power to do so. He got 12 lawyers, immigrant rights lawyers, on this petition, and went to the offices and did sit-ins all over the country at Obama's office. And they caved. And now dreamers have papers because of that movement. Now, and it's been hard for Trump to actually eliminate those rights because it's so popular. This, to me, is the resurrection. We have to tell our stories. We have to reach our own community. And this is what I think the Catholic Peace Ministry does. It's about all of us struggling in our community to make the norm peace and justice, to make the norm in our communities, the spirit that lives on in us in the death of my father, and in the resurrection of my family, and in the resurrection with all of you. You are the Spirit. Thank you.